They say every man has a line he won't cross, a point where procedure ends and conscience begins. I found my line on the third day of the flood, half submerged in the cold, gray water that had swallowed Pine Hollow whole. The sky had been the color of a bruised slate for 72 hours, and a cold rain, driven by winds that screamed through the sagging power lines, still whipped sideways. From the deck of our steel-gray rescue boat, the town I'd served for 10 years was unrecognizable. Porches, shops, fences, memories. All of it drowned under a churning, muddy surface that smelled of oil, wood rot, and something sickly sweet like spoiled milk. My name is Cole Anderson, and for most of my 33 years, I've been good at following the rules. Years on the force teach you to compartmentalize, to see the world in sectors and clearance codes. But it was the years before that, growing up with just my mom and a scruffy terrier mix named Patches, that taught me what not to ignore. A whimper in the dark, a loyalty that asks for nothing but deserves everything. At the stern, my partner, Deputy David Chen, was all business. David's a good cop, practical to a fault, with streaks of gray slicing through his thick black beard that spoke of more floods and fires than either of us cared to remember. He held none of my sentimentality. "Block C cleared," he said over the motor's low whine, his voice flat. "House 21, green tagged. Confirmed evacuation yesterday morning." I nodded, my eyes scanning the row of silent, flooded homes. A rusting mailbox bobbed past like a floating tombstone. The water lapped at the windowsills, turning familiar houses into vacant, staring skulls. Then I heard it. It wasn't a yelp or a cry. It was a bark. Faint, hoarse, muffled, as though it came from behind thick walls or from under the water itself. I straightened instantly, my hand tightening on the metal railing. "Did you hear that?" David blinked, his brow furrowed against the rain. "Hear what, Cole?" "The wind?" There it was again. A pause, then a second bark, even fainter this time, followed by a low, metallic scrape, like claws dragging across wood. "That house," I said, pointing toward number 21, the one he just cleared. "Something's in there." "That house was empty yesterday," David countered, his voice laced with the exhaustion we all felt. "Could be a cat, an echo. We don't have time for strays, Cole. We've got nursing homes still half flooded." He was right. Procedure was right. The checklist was right. But the sound was wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. I didn't argue, I just unstrapped my vest. "Anderson, come on!" My boots hit the water before he could finish the sentence. It surged to my thighs immediately, frigid and full of unseen dangers. I moved through it like a soldier in a minefield, each step measured, careful. "Something's alive in there," I said, and the conviction in my own voice surprised me. I had to know. The house loomed ahead, 21 Maple Avenue, a sagging one-story cottage with chipped yellow siding and shutters hanging askew. The front door, marked with the faint green spray paint of an evacuated checkmark, was swollen shut from the water. It took 3 hard slams of my shoulder before the latch gave way with a wet, splintering crack. The darkness swallowed me whole. The air was thick, humid, and stank of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom like a blade, revealing a scene of quiet chaos. Furniture floated like forgotten corpses. An upside-down lamp spun slowly in a private, silent dance. And that's when I heard it again. A bark, this time so weak it was barely a breath, followed by frantic scratching. The sound was coming from the end of the narrow hallway, from behind a closed door. As I waited closer, my boots brushed against the flotsam of a ruined life. A child's toy car, a waterlogged pillow, a warped photo frame. I squinted at the door. Heavy wood, once white, now swollen and stained dark. But what made me stop cold? What made my heart begin to pound, not with fear, but with a cold fury I hadn't felt in years, wasn't the door itself. It was what was blocking it. A large sofa, pushed flat against the doorframe from this side. It wasn't floating. It hadn't been shifted by the current. Its legs were wedged against the opposite hallway wall with force, deliberately. No one would do this by accident. This was a cage, This was a tomb. Behind the door came one final sound, a paw scratching wood, slower this time, weaker. Then a final, choked bark that was little more than a sigh, and then silence. I didn't hesitate. I braced myself, shoved my shoulder hard against the swollen wood, and felt it crack. The hinges shrieked as the door burst open with a sucking splash of foul-smelling water. The room beyond was nearly pitch black. My flashlight swept across peeling wallpaper until it landed on the source of the sound. Wedged into the highest corner of the flooded room, half standing on a tipped-over cabinet with the filthy water brushing against his underbelly, was a German shepherd. He was shaking violently, legs stiff, fur matted in thick, mud-caked cords. He looked no more than 6 or 7, but the wear on his body made him seem ancient. His once noble posture had collapsed into sheer survival. Dark eyes, once likely alert and sharp, were now clouded with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. They locked onto mine with a flicker of something. Not recognition. Maybe just hope. "Easy, buddy," I whispered, stepping into the room. "I've got you now." He didn't growl. He didn't retreat. He just let out one last strangled, rasping bark, and then his body gave out, collapsing into the water with a heavy splash. I surged forward, catching him under the torso. He was dead weight in my arms as I lifted him up and out into the hallway. "David!" My voice cracked. "I need the kit. Now!" On the porch, I laid him gently on the driest spot we could find. He was barely breathing. As I worked to clear his airway, my fingers brushed against a wet paper tag tied around his neck with twine. I peeled it off carefully. The ink had bled, but I could still make out the words written in stark, cruel capital letters. "Ranger. No priority. Do not rescue." The words felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just abandonment. This was a death sentence. Sarah Jenkins, one of our best paramedics, was already there, kneeling beside me. "You weren't kidding," she muttered, her practiced hands immediately running over the dog's limbs, checking his gums, his temperature. "He's hypothermic, close to shock, but his heart's strong. We've got maybe an hour window to get him stabilized." As she worked, I grabbed the microchip scanner from our kit, running it across the back of the dog's neck, then along his left shoulder where the implant usually rested. The device blinked red and let out a single sharp beep. "No data found," I said, my jaw tightening. He was chipped, or he had been. David knelt beside me, holding his flashlight steady. "There's a scar here, Cole," he murmured, pointing to a spot just behind the shoulder blades, mostly hidden beneath the matted fur. I pushed the fur back. It wasn't a fresh wound. It had healed months, maybe years ago. A clean, surgical line. I ran my fingers along his spine, my breath catching in my throat as I found another one, older, just above the base of his tail. "Jesus," I muttered. "This dog's been through hell." "That's not from any accident," David said grimly. "That's surgical. Someone carved his identity right out of him." The dog, Ranger, I thought, the name on the note fitting him like a ghost, stirred weakly, a soft groan of pain. I hadn't even realized I was talking to him. "You're okay now, Ranger. You're safe." David stood up, staring down at the dog, a strange look of dawning recognition on his face. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the rain and Sarah's quiet work. "Ranger," he said, his voice low and distant. "I know that name." I looked up at him. "What are you talking about?" "There was a K9 case a couple of years back," he said, his eyes never leaving the dog's still form. "German Shepherd, ex-special deployment, part of a human trafficking bust. The dog went missing after the case was shut down. Rumor was it had bitten the wrong guy. Someone higher up." He paused, looking from the dog's scarred body to my face, the pieces clicking into place behind his eyes. "Someone wanted him erased." Erased. The word hung in the damp air between us, colder than the floodwater swirling at our knees. David's pronouncement wasn't a theory. It felt like a verdict that had been handed down long ago. We had just saved a dog's life, but I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that we had stumbled into the middle of a story that had begun years before this storm ever formed. The dog wasn't just a victim, he was a witness, and his testimony was etched into his own skin. While Ranger, the name now felt both like a ghost and a promise, was rushed to the mobile vet unit Sarah Jenkins had set up at the station, my own work was just beginning. The exhaustion that had settled into my bones from days of rescue work was burned away by a new, sharp-edged energy. It was the familiar hum of the hunt, but this time it was personal. My first stop was the community center, the town's primary evacuation shelter. The air inside was a thick mix of antiseptic, wet wool, and the low murmur of collective anxiety. Families huddled on cots, their faces pale masks of shock and exhaustion. I moved past them with purpose, a damp notepad in one hand and a ghost of a German shepherd in my mind. I found Captain Marcus Thorne near the intake desk. He had the squared-off shoulders of a man used to giving orders and the wary eyes of someone with something to hide. Even in a faded flannel shirt and jeans, he carried an air of rigid authority. His daughter, a slim, haunted-looking girl of about 14 named Emily, stood beside him, clutching a worn paperback novel like a shield. "Captain Thorne," I began, keeping my voice even. "Officer Cole Anderson. I'm running evac verifications for Maple Avenue." His eyes, a flat, washed-out blue, flicked to my badge and then back to my face. "We're fine, officer. Checked in yesterday." "I just have to confirm a few details for the record," I said, my gaze steady. "When you evacuated your home at 21 Maple Avenue, did you leave anyone or anything behind?" His jaw clenched just for a second. "It's just me and my daughter," he said, his voice flat. "We're all that matters." "No pets, then?" I pressed. "Never had any," he replied, the lie so smooth it was almost believable. But then I saw it, the flicker of movement from the girl, Emily. Her eyes, wide and full of a fear that her father's words couldn't hide, dropped to the floor. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her book. I changed my approach. "We found a dog today," I said casually, watching her reaction. "A German shepherd, locked inside one of the houses on your street. Thought he might have belonged to one of your neighbors." The girl's head shot up. Her lips parted slightly. Is he okay?" The question slipped out too fast, too natural, laced with genuine concern. Thorne's gaze snapped to her, a look of pure ice. "Emily." She flinched and looked down, her cheeks coloring. I just heard someone else mention it," she stammered. It was a small thing, a single word, but in that moment, she told me everything her father was trying to hide. Not it. He. This was no stray. "We're tired, officer," Thorne said, stepping slightly in front of his daughter. A human wall. "If that's all," I gave a tight nod. "That's all for now." As I turned away, I didn't miss the tremble in Emily's hands, or the way her eyes followed me, filled with an unspoken plea. My next stop was a conversation with an 82-year-old widow from their street, a woman named Eleanor Gable. She was a firecracker with a memory like a steel trap. When I asked about the Callaways, her pale blue eyes narrowed. "Oh, I know their dog," she said, her voice sharp. "That poor creature. Sat outside their house every morning like a gargoyle. Never barked, never moved much. Just stared straight ahead." She pulled her cardigan tighter. "That man, Thorne, I saw him kick the dog more than once when he thought no one was looking. But the dog, it never fought back. Just stood there and took it, like he was programmed to." Programmed. The word echoed in my head. The next morning, armed with a search warrant and the company of Detective Isabella Rossi, I was back at 21 Maple Avenue. Rossi was new to Pine Hollow, a sharp, efficient transfer from Denver, who saw the world in evidence and motive. She didn't waste words. As we pushed open the warped front door, the stench of stale floodwater hit us again. This time we weren't on a rescue mission. We were at a crime scene. "Mrs. Gable's testimony and the daughter's reaction give us cause," Rossi said, her eyes scanning the debris-filled room. "Let's find what he didn't want us to see." We moved past the hallway where I'd found Ranger and headed toward a rear utility room, a space that had been blocked by a fallen beam during my first entry. Together, we lifted a heavy storage cabinet that had been flipped by the flood. Behind it, wedged between the wall and a pile of warped cardboard boxes, was an old wooden dresser. Its back panel was cracked. Rossi crouched, shining her light into the gap. "Something there." My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached into the narrow, dusty space. My fingers brushed against something plastic. After a moment, I pulled it out. A simple Ziploc bag, coated in dust and mildew. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was holding the heart of this whole ugly story. Inside the bag, Rossi and I carefully laid out the contents on a dry patch of countertop. There were three things. First was the K9 microchip unit itself, a tiny glass cylinder, no bigger than a grain of rice. So small, so easy to discard, so easy to carve from the flesh of a living creature. Second was a laminated ID badge from the Pine Hollow Police Department. It showed a black and white photo of a proud, handsome German Shepherd in his prime. Clipped to it was a folded registration form bearing the seal of our department. The handler's name was printed clearly, Captain Marcus Thorne. Scrawled across the front of the ID in jagged red ink were two words, retired, inactive. And third, tucked into the final fold of the registration, was a small slip of paper. On it, a handwritten note in faded blue ink. I recognized the sharp, aggressive handwriting from old departmental memos. Thorne's handwriting. He failed once. Not worth saving again. Rossi read it over my shoulder. "That's cold," she breathed. "Real cold." I stared at the words, the same cold, detached cruelty as the note tied around Ranger's neck. This was premeditated. Thorne hadn't just abandoned his dog in a disaster. He had spent years trying to methodically, surgically, erase him from existence. The question was no longer who, but why. Why go to such lengths to dispose of a dog? The answer began to surface that afternoon, arriving in two fractured pieces from two different directions. The first piece came from a dispatch call. An overturned SUV had been located in a muddy ditch off Route 9. The vehicle was registered to Helen Thorne, Marcus's wife. I drove out to the crash site myself. The silver SUV was wedged against a cluster of river birches, its windows cracked but not shattered. The driver's side door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. There was no sign of Helen. But on the floorboard of the passenger side, its contents spilled across the muddy mat, was a reusable grocery bag. Inside, a box of dog biscuits, a dented can of beef stew, and a small, clean blanket, rolled and tied with twine. My blood ran cold. She wasn't fleeing from Thorne. She was going back for the dog. She had tried to do the right thing. While the search drone combed the woods for Helen, Rossi and I went hunting for a different kind of ghost. We were in the county courthouse archives, a basement room that smelled of dust and decaying paper. We were looking for any file related to Thorne's time as head of the K9 division. We found it in a box marked Task Force Joint Ops, 2018. The folder was thin. The operation was called Haven. It had only lasted 6 months before being dissolved under review. Inside, stapled reports and mission debriefs spilled the truth in ugly, bureaucratic typewriter ink. And there, in a field report dated February 12, 2018, I found the story Thorne had tried to bury. The narrative was brief, dry, and clinical. During recovery of a minor victim inside a human smuggling container, K9 Ranger entered prior to clearance. Handler, Thorne, was off comms. Subject minor recovered alive. Officer Bennett, lieutenant, killed by assailant, hiding in secondary unit. Investigation inconclusive. Ranger removed from active duty upon recommendation of supervising officer. The signature at the bottom was Marcus Thorne's. I slammed the file shut, the sound echoing in the silent, dusty room. "He buried him," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He buried him for saving a child." Rossi leaned over the folder, her keen eyes absorbing the text. Ranger was faster than the team. He did what he was trained to do, and he was successful. A child is alive because of him. And in the chaos, I finished, the whole ugly picture finally snapping into focus. An officer died. Thorne, the man in charge, needed a scapegoat to save his career from an investigation into his own command failure. What's easier to blame than a dog who can't speak for himself? That was the failure. Not Ranger's. Thorne's. He had stripped Ranger of his honor, his identity, and left him to rot in a basement, all to cover up his own incompetence. He had tried to erase the one living witness to his disgrace. Just then, my radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the heavy silence of the archives. "Unit 23, We've got eyes on Helen Thorne. She's been found alive, holed up in a hunting cabin about 2 miles north of the crash site. The hunt was over. We had the evidence. We had the motive. And now we had the final witness. Helen Thorne's story was the final heartbreaking nail in her husband's coffin. Holed up in that tiny hunting cabin, wrapped in a quilt and clutching a mug of warm broth, she recounted a story of escalating cruelty and paranoia. She told the district attorney about the night she caught Marcus mixing something into Ranger's food and had to dump it, telling him the dog had run off just to keep him safe in the basement. She spoke of the man she married slowly disappearing, replaced by a bitter shell of a man obsessed with a single failure. A failure he had pinned on the most loyal creature he had ever known. Her failed attempt to rescue Ranger ahead of the storm was not the act of an accomplice, but of a desperate woman trying to save the last innocent soul in her house. Her testimony, combined with the evidence from the Ziploc bag and my own report, was more than enough. A preliminary hearing was set. It wasn't a full trial, but a place for truth to finally have its day. The old wood-paneled courtroom on the second floor of the Pine Hollow Courthouse felt more like a school auditorium than a place of law. A cold December wind rattled the tall windows, and outside, the last of the snow from the storm clung to the curbs. I sat in the second row, my hand resting on the leash of the German Shepherd beside me. In the weeks since his rescue, Ranger's coat had grown glossier, his frame less gaunt. He was still quiet, but his eyes, deep and brown, no longer held the dullness of defeat. They held a watchful sorrow, the quiet dignity of a soul who had waited too long for justice. He sat obediently at my feet, a statue of fur and dignity, his ears twitching at the low murmurs in the chamber. Across the room at the defense table sat Captain Marcus Thorne. He was dressed in a pressed gray blazer, trying hard to look respectable, untouchable. His face was a stoic mask, but I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible flicker of nerves in his eyes every time the dog's name was mentioned. The judge entered, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Eleanor Vance. She'd presided over Pine Hollow for nearly 2 decades and was known for her measured tone and unwillingness to entertain theatrics. "This hearing is in session," she said, her voice echoing gently. The proceedings began. The evidence was presented, the doctored records, the veterinary report on the likely attempted poisoning, the Ziploc bag with its damning contents, and the handwritten note. When the assistant district attorney, a sharp woman named Olivia Reed, stood and called for Ranger to be brought forward, the room shifted. I tightened my grip on the leash. "You ready, partner?" I whispered. Ranger gave no sound but walked forward with a quiet determination, his gait strong and steady. As we passed the defense table, Thorne scoffed, loud enough for all to hear. "Still alive, huh? Waste of tax money." But Ranger didn't even look at him. He walked past the man who had been his handler, his abuser, his judge and jury, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He ignored Thorne's smirk completely. Instead, he moved straight toward the gallery seats, right to where Emily Thorne sat clutching her mother's sleeve. The girl gasped when Ranger nudged her leg gently with his nose. Then, with a quiet reverence that silenced the room, Ranger leaned up and softly licked her hand. No bark, no growl. Just a simple, profound gesture of grace. Emily's bottom lip trembled, and a single tear traced a path down her pale cheek. The moment hung suspended in the quiet courtroom. Then Ranger turned, slowly, deliberately. He fixed his gaze on Marcus Thorne. His ears rose, his shoulders squared, and from deep in his chest came a sound I had never heard from him before. It wasn't a sound of aggression or fear. It was a sound of memory, a deep, low rumble of judgment, clear, unbroken, and rising in volume. It was the voice he'd been denied for so long. Thorne flinched. It was a small, involuntary movement, but everyone saw it. He shrank back in his chair, the mask of indifference finally cracking. "Is there a problem, Mr. Thorne?" Judge Vance asked, her eyes peering over her reading glasses. "It's a dog, Your Honor. Nothing more," Thorne managed, clearing his throat. But it was too late. From the gallery, Emily stood up. She didn't wait to be called, didn't look to her mother for permission. Her voice was shaky but firm, and it cut through the silence. "Ranger, He didn't deserve what happened, she said, tears now spilling freely. None of it. She took a shuddering breath. Dad made me write that note, she confessed, her voice cracking. The one that said, do not rescue. He told me to tie it around Ranger's neck. He said if I didn't, he'd put me in the basement with him. A collective gasp went through the room. Helen Thorne pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, her own face a mask of pain and rage. The silence was absolute. Judge Vance turned her gaze slowly, deliberately to Clint. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of steel. The court, she began, her voice unwavering, finds substantial cause to open a full criminal investigation into Mr. Marcus Thorne's conduct regarding falsified documentation, abuse of a certified law enforcement K-9, and coercion of a minor. As such, you are formally stripped of all handling certifications, and your rights to animal custody are permanently revoked. Thorne's face tightened, his jaw locking as the words hit him like physical blows. He said nothing. He had nothing left to say. Judge Vance wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, it is the decision of the Council of Police Oversight that the K-9 known as Ranger, having been wrongfully dismissed from duty and subjected to intentional harm, shall be reinstated posthumously to full honor and service. The courtroom remained silent for a long beat. My own breath was caught in my chest. Reinstated. The word was a balm on a wound I hadn't even known I was carrying for him. And then she said the words that changed my life. Officer Cole Anderson has been selected and approved as his permanent custodian and partner. My hand went to Ranger's head, and I felt a profound sense of rightness, a click of the universe falling into place. In that moment, looking down at the noble dog who had endured so much, I knew who had really rescued whom. From the back of the room, a single person began to clap. Just once, then again, slowly. It was Detective Rossi. Her applause was followed by another and another, until the room was filled with the sound of quiet, solemn acknowledgement. It wasn't a celebration, it was something deeper. It was the collective sigh of overdue justice. That evening, the town hall auditorium was transformed for a modest but heartfelt ceremony. The people of the town came, not just officers, but shop owners, teachers, and students. People who remembered the vague headlines from years ago about a K-9 that disobeyed, and who now understood the truth. When it was my turn to speak, I walked slowly to the microphone with Ranger at my side. He wore a new K-9 vest, a simple gold badge embroidered on the side, a symbol of restoration. The cameras from the local news station flicked on, but I wasn't thinking about them. I looked down at the dog beside me and took a breath. He was left to die, I said, my voice clear. Tied alone behind a door meant never to be opened again. He didn't survive because of a mission. He didn't hold on for orders. He survived because something in him still believed in loyalty, even when the world had shown him none. I paused, resting a hand gently on Ranger's head. He reminded me that honor isn't something you're given. It's something you choose. Every single time, even when no one is watching. He wasn't just a K-9. He was the better part of what law enforcement is meant to be. The audience stood, their applause reverent, a tribute. After the ceremony, as a light snow began to fall again outside Pine Hollow's town hall, Ranger and I sat on the cold stone steps. A few children approached cautiously to pet him. One young boy with his arm in a cast looked up at me, his eyes wide with wonder. He's like a superhero, he whispered. I looked at Ranger, who leaned his head against my leg, his eyes soft, as if finally, after all the storms and cages and silence, he knew he was home. No, I said quietly, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He's better than that. He's real. The story of Ranger is more than a simple animal rescue. It is a profound lesson in dignity, loyalty, and the true measure of a life. In our later years, having witnessed the full spectrum of life's triumphs and trials, this story resonates deeply, reminding us of timeless truths. The greatest lesson lies in the contrast between hollow honor and true dignity. Captain Thorne had rank and authority, but his dignity was as thin as a coat, easily cast aside to cover his own failings. In contrast, Ranger, stripped of everything, his identity, his health, and his right to live, retained a quiet nobility. Officer Cole, by following the call of his conscience over orders, demonstrated a dignity greater than any title. In our own lives, we often meet those who wear the mask of success and position, but a person's real worth is revealed in how they treat the most vulnerable beings when no one is watching. Ranger's journey also teaches us that the past, no matter how damaged or forgotten, does not define our future. Betrayed and left for dead, Ranger did not become hateful. Instead, he offered gentleness to the young girl, Emily, and reserved his judgment only for the one who wronged him. This shows that recovery and a new beginning are always possible, regardless of the scars we carry. Kindness, even a small act like Officer Cole's, has the power to heal and to rewrite life's final chapters brilliantly. Ultimately, the story reminds us to seek and cherish the silent heroes all around us. For true value is found not in applause or public recognition, but in loyalty that never fades and the quiet courage to do what is right.